There are places in this world where the scale of things refuses to fit inside the human frame of reference, where the sky is not a ceiling but an event, where the grass goes on so long in every direction that the horizon becomes a physical presence rather than a concept, and where the mountains, when they finally appear, do so with such abruptness and such size that they feel less like geography and more like a statement. Montana is one of those places. The fourth largest state in the United States, over 147,000 square miles of prairie and mountain and river basin, a place where the human population, just over 1 million people, is so sparse relative to the land that you can drive for 2 hours without passing a gas station, where cattle outnumber people by more than 3 to 1, where the nearest neighbor might be 40 miles away across a valley that contains nothing but grass and sky and the shadows of clouds moving across both. It is a place that asks something of you when you enter it. It asks you to become smaller than you are used to being, to accept that the land here does not organize itself around human convenience, and that the things that happened in this soil and beneath it and above it are older and stranger and more consequential than most people who have never been here have any reason to suspect. Let us begin with what lies beneath the surface, because in Montana, the ground is a library. One of the richest fossil beds in the world runs through the eastern half of the state, through the badlands and river drainages of the Hell Creek Formation, a geological layer deposited during the last few million years of the Cretaceous period, the final chapter of the age of dinosaurs. Montana has produced more significant dinosaur discoveries than almost any other location on Earth. In 1902, paleontologist Barnum Brown discovered the first nearly complete skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus rex in the Hell Creek Badlands, a find that changed the world's understanding of what the Cretaceous period looked like. But T-Rex is only the most famous resident of Montana's fossil record. The state has yielded Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, Ankylosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, and dozens of other species. In 1978, paleontologist Jack Horner, who would later serve as the scientific consultant for the Jurassic Park films, discovered evidence of dinosaur nesting colonies near Choteau in north-central Montana, a find that fundamentally altered the scientific understanding of dinosaur behavior and social structure. Before Horner's work in Montana, dinosaurs were considered solitary reptilian animals with no parental behavior. After it, they became understood as social creatures that nested in colonies, cared for their young, and potentially traveled in herds. Everything that popular culture knows about dinosaurs as attentive, behaviorally complex animals traces back in large part to a field in central Montana where Jack Horner found eggs. And the discoveries are not over. As of today, paleontologists working the Hell Creek Formation continue to find species that have never been documented before. The ground in eastern Montana is still giving up its dead, slowly, as the erosion of the Badlands exposes what was sealed inside the rock 66 million years ago when the asteroid hit and the Cretaceous ended. If you know where to look, and some ranchers in eastern Montana know exactly where to look, you can walk across a hillside and find pieces of animals that no human being has ever seen before, sticking out of the ground like fragments of a world that was ended before anyone was there to watch it go. But the fossil record of Montana goes deeper than the dinosaurs, and into territory that is stranger in a different way. In the western part of the state, in the sedimentary rocks of Glacier National Park and the surrounding mountains, there are structures called stromatolites, layered formations created by colonies of cyanobacteria, some of the earliest life forms on Earth. The stromatolites in Glacier National Park are approximately 1.5 billion years old. 1.5 billion years. They predate multicellular life. They predate plants. They predate animals of any kind. They are the preserved record of microbial mats that grew in shallow Precambrian seas before anything with a nervous system had yet figured out how to exist. You can touch them. They are exposed in the rock faces of Glacier National Park, in walls and ledges that hikers pass every summer without knowing what they are looking at. The walls of Glacier contain a timeline of life on Earth that begins before eyes existed to see it, and it is all there, in the stone, accessible to anyone willing to walk far enough. Now we need to talk about the mountains themselves. because in Montana, the mountains do not ease you in. The Rocky Mountains enter Montana from the south and fan out across the western third of the state in a series of ranges: the Bitterroots, the Missions, the Beartooths, the Absarokas, the Crazies, the swans that overlap and interlock in a pattern so complex that cartographers have spent 2 centuries trying to fully systematize it. The Beartooth Plateau in south-central Montana near the Wyoming border is one of the most extreme landscapes in the lower 48 states, a high alpine plateau averaging over 10,000 feet in elevation, where the growing season lasts approximately 6 weeks, where snow can fall in any month of the year, and where the road that crosses it, the Beartooth Highway, called by many the most beautiful road in America, climbs from 5,000 feet to nearly 11,000 feet in less than 30 miles through a series of switchbacks so dramatic that first-time drivers frequently stop the car simply because they cannot process what they are seeing. And Glacier National Park, in the northwest corner of the state, is a place so concentrated in geological drama that it was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site and an International Peace Park shared with Canada's Waterton Lakes National Park across the border. The park contains over 700 miles of trails, 130 named lakes, 2 continental divides, and, until recently, 150 glaciers. Today, it has 26. The glaciers of Glacier National Park have been retreating at a rate that scientists describe as among the most visible and measurable evidence of climate change available in the United States. A photograph taken of any named glacier in Glacier National Park today, placed next to a photograph of the same glacier taken in 1966, shows a difference so dramatic that the 2 images appear to depict different places. The park may be glacier-free within decades. Its name will remain. The ice that gave it the name will not. Montana has more cattle than people. And this fact is not simply a demographic curiosity. It is the organizing principle of the state's economy, culture, and self-image. The cattle ranching tradition of Montana goes back to the 1860s, when Texas longhorns were driven north into the Montana Territory to graze on the unfenced grasslands of the High Plains. The open range era of Montana, the brief, violent, profitable period between roughly 1,866 and 1,886. When cattle ranchers ran herds of hundreds of thousands of animals across unfenced federal land, is the source of the mythology of the American West as it exists in movies and novels: the cowboy, the cattle drive, the range war, the hired gun. And it ended not with a law or a battle, but with a winter. The winter of 1886 to 1887, known in Montana as the Great Die-Up, was the worst winter in the recorded history of the northern Great Plains. Temperatures dropped to minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow fell continuously for weeks. The cattle, which had been overstocked on overgrazed range and had no reserves of fat, died in their hundreds of thousands. Some ranches lost 90% of their herds. The open range era ended in a single season. The ranchers who survived it rebuilt behind fences, with hay stored for winter, with a different understanding of what the Montana landscape would and would not permit. The bones of the cattle that died in that winter bleached on the prairies for years afterward, and Charles Russell, who would become Montana's most famous artist, was a young cowhand during that winter. He painted what he saw of its aftermath, and the painting he made, now known as Waiting for a Chinook, showed a single starving steer standing in deep snow while wolves circled at the edge of the frame. He sent it to his employer as a reply to a letter asking how the cattle were doing. It became one of the most famous images of the American West. Now we go to the sky over Montana, because the sky over Montana is not like the sky anywhere else in the continental United States. The state's nickname is Big Sky Country, and the name is not marketing hyperbole, it is a geographic reality. In a landscape with no tall buildings, no tree canopy, minimal humidity, and a horizon that, in the eastern plains, can be 60 miles distant in every direction, the sky occupies a proportion of the visual field that is genuinely unusual. On a clear night in eastern Montana, away from any population center, the Milky Way is not a faint smear, it is a structure, a 3-dimensional band of light so dense and so detailed that the brain struggles to process it as something that exists at a distance of thousands of light years, rather than something directly overhead. Montana has some of the least light-polluted skies in the continental United States. And in that dark sky, things are seen. Not all of them are stars. Montana has a documented and sustained history of UFO sightings that goes back decades, and that involves a category of witnesses, ranchers, pilots, law enforcement officers, state troopers not typically associated with wishful thinking or susceptibility to suggestion. The Malmstrom Air Force Base, located near Great Falls in north-central Montana, has been the site of one of the most significant and least publicized incidents in the history of American military encounters with unexplained aerial phenomena. In March of 1967, officers at Malmstrom reported that multiple Minuteman nuclear missiles in their launch facilities went simultaneously offline, their launch capability disabled in a sequence that the Air Force's own investigation could not attribute to any mechanical failure, electrical fault, or human error. At the same time, security personnel at the base reported observing a glowing disc-shaped object hovering over the missile field. The incident was classified for decades. It has since been partially declassified and investigated by researchers, including former military personnel who were present. The Air Force has never provided a satisfactory explanation for why 10 nuclear missiles went offline simultaneously on the night that the object was seen. The missiles came back online the next morning. No explanation has ever been formally issued. And beneath that big sky, in the long grass of the eastern plains, there are towns, or there were. The history of settlement in eastern Montana is one of the most concentrated stories of American optimism and American failure in the country's record. In the early 20th century, following the Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909, which offered 320 acres of free land to anyone willing to farm it, hundreds of thousands of settlers poured into eastern Montana. Towns appeared across the plains faster than the land could support them by 1917. Eastern Montana had more incorporated towns than it does today. Schools and churches and newspapers and banks serving communities that the promoters promised would become the breadbasket of the world. Then the drought came. Then the Great Depression, then the Dust Bowl. The towns emptied faster than they had filled. Today, eastern Montana is dotted with the ruins of that failed optimism. Grain elevators standing in fields with no towns around them. Stone foundations of schools that graduated one class before the families left. Cemeteries maintained by nobody for communities that ceased to exist within living memory. The town of Ismay in Custer County once had a population of several hundred. Today, it has fewer than 20 permanent residents and is primarily known for briefly renaming itself Joe Montana in 1993 as a promotional stunt tied to the San Francisco 49ers quarterback. The rename lasted. The population did not recover. There are dozens of Ismays in eastern Montana places that had names and post offices and general stores and dreams that the land declined to support. But the people who were in Montana before any of this arrived, before the homesteaders, before the ranchers, before the Lewis and Clark expedition that passed through in 1805, had their own relationship with the land that neither the settlers nor the surveyors ever fully understood. The Blackfoot Confederacy, one of the most powerful indigenous nations of the Northern Plains, controlled the territory that is now northern Montana and southern Alberta for centuries before European contact, organizing their society around the bison herds that covered the plains in numbers that contemporary accounts describe as beyond counting. Estimates of the original North American bison population range from 30 to 60 million. Animals, a density of large mammals that had no equivalent anywhere else on the planet. The Blackfoot, the Crow, the Assiniboine, the Sioux, the nations of the Northern Plains developed cultures of extraordinary sophistication built around the bison, and the destruction of those cultures came through the destruction of the herds. Between 1870 and 1884, commercial hunters reduced the bison population of the Northern Plains from an estimated 10 million animals to fewer than 1,000. It was the largest and fastest destruction of a wildlife population in recorded human history. conducted not accidentally, but deliberately as an explicit strategy of the United States government to deprive the Plains nations of their food source and force them onto reservations. In Montana, the last large free herd of Plains bison was destroyed in the winter of 1883 to 1884. The Blackfoot people who had followed those herds for centuries faced starvation. In the winter of 1883 to 1884, known in Blackfoot oral history as the Starvation Winter, an estimated 600 Blackfoot people died of hunger on the Blackfeet Reservation in northern Montana, while government food rations that were supposed to have been delivered were delayed, mismanaged, and in some cases, simply never sent. The agent responsible was later investigated. No criminal charges were filed. Now let us talk about a place in Montana that exists at a scale even the rest of Montana struggles to contain. Glacier National Park covers over 1 million acres of the Rocky Mountains in the northwest corner of the state. A landscape so concentrated in what geologists call glacially carved terrain, U-shaped valleys, cirques, arêtes, horn peaks, moraines, that it reads as a textbook illustration of what an ice age does to a mountain range. But what Glacier also contains, and what most visitors do not know, is one of the most significant Native American sacred landscapes in North America. The Blackfeet call the mountains that became Glacier National Park Mistakis, the backbone of the world, and they regarded the territory not as wilderness in the Western sense of an uninhabited place, but as a living landscape dense with spiritual significance, where every named peak and valley and lake had a place in their cosmology and their history. The park was created in 1910 over the objections of the Blackfeet, whose treaty rights to the land were reinterpreted by the federal government in a process that the Blackfeet have contested ever since. The mountains the park was built on have Blackfeet names that predate the English names on the park's signs by centuries. The backbone of the world was always there. The national park is a recent addition to a much longer story. We need to talk about the rivers, because Montana's rivers are not simply scenic features. They are the veins of the ecosystem and some of the most contested and ecologically significant waterways in the American West. The Missouri River begins in Montana, at the confluence of the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin rivers near the town of Three Forks, a location so geographically significant that the Lewis and Clark expedition spent days documenting and debating it in 1805. The upper Missouri and its tributaries contain the last free-flowing stretches of the original Missouri River system, the stretches that were never dammed and that still run through landscape that, in certain sections, looks almost exactly as it did when Lewis and Clark described it. The upper Yellowstone River, which runs through south-central Montana before crossing into Yellowstone National Park, is the longest undammed river in the contiguous United States, 692 miles from its source to its confluence with the Missouri, running free the entire length. And in these rivers lives the bull trout, a species that requires water so cold and so clean that its presence in a river is used by scientists as an indicator of watershed health, a biological benchmark so sensitive that a river capable of supporting bull trout is, by definition, a river that has not been significantly degraded. The bull trout is threatened in most of its former range. In Montana's coldest and most remote headwater streams, it persists. There is a weather phenomenon in Montana that has no equivalent elsewhere in the contiguous United States with the same frequency and intensity, and it is called the Chinook. A Chinook is a warm, dry wind that descends from the Rocky Mountains onto the eastern plains, driven by high-pressure systems that force air down the eastern slopes of the Rockies, where it compresses and heats at a rate of approximately 5 degrees Fahrenheit per 1,000 feet of descent. The result can be a temperature increase of 40, 50, or even 60 degrees Fahrenheit within a matter of hours. The most extreme recorded Chinook event in American history occurred in Spearfish, South Dakota, in 1943, when the temperature rose 49 degrees in 2 minutes. But Montana experiences Chinooks regularly. And the cultural and practical significance of the warm wind to the people of the Eastern Plains and to the cattle that have survived in the Montana winter on its arrival is difficult to overstate. The Blackfoot word for Chinook translates roughly as snow eater. It arrives from the mountains with a smell of warm stone and evaporates snow in hours, turning frozen ground to mud and raising temperatures high enough that cattle that were hours from freezing can survive. Ranchers in eastern Montana have accounts of watching snow disappear in real time, not melting but sublimating, converting directly from ice to water vapor as a Chinook front moves across the plains. The wind arrives unannounced and leaves the same way. And in its aftermath, the plains look like spring, regardless of what the calendar says. Let us go further into what Montana conceals. The Rocky Mountain front, the abrupt eastern edge of the Rockies, where they meet the plains in north-central Montana, is one of the most dramatic geological boundaries in North America. A place where the mountains rise directly from the flat prairie in walls of rock that can exceed a vertical mile, with no foothills to ease the transition. The front is also one of the most ecologically intact wildlife corridors left in the lower 48 states, a place where grizzly bears, mountain lions, wolves, and elk move between the high country in summer and the plains in winter through terrain that has never been developed and that is maintained in something close to its original ecological condition by a combination of geographic inaccessibility and the resistance of local ranching families to outside development. The grizzly bear population of the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, which centers on Glacier National Park and the Rocky Mountain front, is the largest grizzly population in the continental United States outside of Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. There are grizzlies in this part of Montana that have never seen a human being. There are grizzlies that have, and remember, encounters between grizzlies and humans on the Rocky Mountain front are documented regularly. And the question of how the expansion of the grizzly population, which is recovering under federal protection, interacts with the ranching economy of the front communities is one of the most actively contested conservation policy questions in the American West. The grizzly does not negotiate. It existed in this landscape for hundreds of thousands of years before any ranch was built in its territory, and it operates on that understanding. Now we go to the most remote and most deliberately overlooked part of Montana's human history, the military. Montana is home to Malmstrom Air Force Base, one of 3 Air Force bases in the United States that operate land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. Malmstrom controls the largest ICBM field in the country. Approximately 150 Minuteman III missiles dispersed across 23,000 square miles of central Montana, buried in hardened silos beneath wheat fields and cattle ranches, maintained by missile crews who live in underground launch control facilities and whose job, should they receive the order, is to launch nuclear weapons capable of destroying cities on the other side of the planet. The missiles of Malmstrom are not a historical artifact. They are operational. They are on alert. They sit beneath the fields of a state that has more cows than people, in the middle of a landscape that most Americans have never seen and would not recognize, connected to a command structure that could activate them in minutes. The ranchers who farm above the silos know where they are. The markers are visible if you know what you are looking for, small, fenced areas in the middle of fields, with a specific configuration of antennas and access roads that do not match any agricultural purpose. Montana is, beneath its pastoral surface, one of the most heavily armed pieces of real estate on the planet. And then there is the Missouri Breaks. Between the town of Fort Benton and the Fort Peck Reservoir in north-central Montana, the Missouri River cuts through a landscape of badlands and coulées and isolated buttes that is one of the most remote and geologically dramatic environments in the lower 48 states. The Missouri Breaks, officially the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument, is a place where the river has cut 300 feet through millions of years of sediment, exposing rock layers that run from ancient seabeds to the Hell Creek Formation itself. A geological cross-section of time that would take a lifetime to fully study. Lewis and Clark passed through this country in 1805 and found it so extraordinary that Meriwether Lewis spent multiple journal entries trying to describe formations that, he wrote, resembled the ruins of ancient cities. The stone figures he described, sandstone pillars and arches and balanced rocks carved by wind and water are still there. Nobody built them. Nothing maintains them. They are in the same condition they were in when Lewis described them, and they will be there long after everything built since his passage has been forgotten. Montana, then, is a place that puts things in perspective in a way that very few places in the modern world still can. It puts the human scale in perspective. Against 147,000 square miles of mountain and plain, 1 million people is not a population, it is a suggestion. It puts human time in perspective against 1.5 billion year old stromatolites and 6 million year old dinosaur bones and glacially carved mountains and rivers that have been running since before the first human footprint was pressed into the mud anywhere on Earth. The centuries of European and American history in Montana are a footnote. And it puts human certainty in perspective against the open sky at night, against the unexplained lights over missile fields, against the grizzly bear that does not acknowledge borders or management plans or the difference between federal land and private land, and against the buffalo bones that still surface in plowed fields in eastern Montana when the frost heaves and the soil shifts and the ground gives back, as it always eventually does, what was put into it. Montana does not care what you brought with you. It was here before you arrived, and it will be here after you leave, turning slowly in the dark under a sky full of stars and a few things that are not stars, saying nothing, holding everything, patient in the way that only very old and very large things can be patient.